My name is Riley Long, and I am 28 years old. 6 months ago, I sat in a dimly lit downtown Seattle restaurant for my own birthday dinner. Outside, the relentless Pacific Northwest rain battered the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside, the air felt even colder. When the waiter brought out a small slice of cake with a single flickering candle, my mother, Valerie, did not sing or smile. She looked at my sensible wool blazer, glanced at my older sister Audrey in her designer silk dress, and let out a long sigh that cut straight through the ambient noise of clinking wine glasses. "You have always been the disappointment, Riley," she said, her tone casual and certain. "Not like your sister. Audrey has vision. You just have jobs." I did not argue or cry. I just sat there, listening to the rain hit the glass. Later, when the bill arrived, Audrey complained loudly about her maxed-out credit cards and her failing lifestyle brand. Valerie just laughed and sipped her Pinot Noir. "Oh, just use your sister's credit, Audrey," my mother said. "I still have that old power of attorney she signed for college emergencies in my desk. The banks never check if it has been updated." They spoke about my financial autonomy like it was a spare tire in their trunk, treating me not as a daughter but as a utility. They thought I was nothing but a useful idiot who would stay quiet to keep the peace. They had no idea that Grandma Edith had slipped a heavy manila envelope into my coat pocket that very night. When they finally found out what was inside it, their entire curated life fell to pieces. Before I tell you what was in that envelope and how it brought my toxic family to their knees, please take a moment to hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from. And welcome back to Zara Told Stories. The dinner concluded in suffocating silence. The restaurant smelled of roasted garlic and expensive perfume, but all I could focus on was the tight knot forming in my stomach. My father, Derek, had spent the entire meal intensely focused on his steak. He was a man who traded his backbone for quiet evenings, choosing complicity over defending his youngest daughter. Whenever I tried to speak, he would just offer a terse nod, a silent plea for me to swallow the insult and keep his life easy. I paid for my own birthday dinner while Audrey posed for selfies in the booth. As we moved to the front lobby to retrieve our coats, Valerie and Audrey were distracted, loudly complaining to the host about the slow valet service. That was when Grandma Edith stepped out of the shadows near the coat check. Edith was a stoic woman who had spent decades managing a vast agricultural plot in eastern Washington. She rarely spoke at these dinners, always watching our toxic family dynamics with sharp, calculating eyes. Her health was failing, a fact my mother often treated as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. As I reached for my damp umbrella, Edith grabbed my wrist. Her skin felt like dry paper, but her grip was like iron. She pressed a thick, heavy envelope into my palm. Her breathing was labored, but her gaze was piercing. "Open this when you are alone, Riley," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the lobby jazz music. "And do not tell your mother." Before I could ask any questions, she stepped back, her expression returning to its usual passive mask, just as Valerie turned around to snap at the valet. I slid the envelope deep into the inner pocket of my coat. It weighed heavily against my chest, a physical anchor in a night that had otherwise made me feel entirely invisible. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. My windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm against the relentless Seattle storm. I gripped the leather steering wheel, letting the heater thaw my frozen hands. For years, I had kept my reality hidden from them. I worked as an operations manager for a prominent eco-logistics software firm. It was a role Valerie considered boring office work, blind to the fact that I had negotiated equity and earned a mid-six-figure salary. I kept my success quiet because every time I shared a milestone in the past, Valerie flattened it to make room for Audrey's superficial triumphs. I parked in the secure underground garage of my high-rise condo, a home I had purchased myself. I rode the elevator to the penthouse level, the silence of the building wrapping around me. I unlocked my door, tossed my keys onto the quartz kitchen island, and pulled the damp coat off my shoulders. I did not bother turning on the main lights. The glow of the city skyline filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope. I tore the thick paper open. 3 items slid out onto the counter: a heavy brass key, a handwritten letter on Edith's personal stationery, and a legal deed. My eyes scanned the deed first, the dense legal jargon blurring before the key details snapped into focus. It was not for her old farmhouse. It was for a sprawling tract of commercial land in eastern Washington. I knew that area. The geography there was dry and sunbaked, far removed from the lush, rainy forests of Seattle. More importantly, that specific tract of land sat directly underneath one of the most lucrative tech data center hubs in the entire state. The property was fully leased to a global software giant. I traced my finger over the bottom of the page. The deed was already in my name. The transfer had been executed and notarized weeks ago. I unfolded the letter, my hands trembling slightly. Riley, the note read, I have watched them shrink you for years. Your mother values optics and your sister values entitlement. I value resilience. This land is yours. The income is yours. Do not let them take it. Build your fortress. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The monthly lease payments generated by that server farm were staggering. In an instant, I was no longer the disappointing daughter in a sensible blazer. I was the commercial landlord to a tech empire. Edith had seen my quiet grind, recognized my endurance, and armed me with the ultimate leverage. The embers of resentment that had burned in my chest for 28 years suddenly ignited into a cold, sharp clarity. I looked at the brass key resting on the stone counter. I did not owe my family my silence anymore, and the trap they were building for themselves was about to snap shut. The air inside the upscale downtown Seattle restaurant hummed with the quiet clatter of silver against porcelain and the low murmur of wealthy patrons. The rain had picked up outside, blurring the streetlights into streaks of gold against the glass, but inside our corner booth felt like an interrogation room. It was my 28th birthday, an occasion that should have warranted at least a token level of celebration. Instead, the evening had quickly devolved into a shrine for my older sister, Audrey. Audrey was an aspiring lifestyle influencer. She spent her days curating an aesthetic that she could not afford, floating on a sea of maxed-out credit cards and our parents' endless financial subsidies. Tonight she wore a designer silk dress that probably cost more than my first car. Her wrists stacked with gold bracelets that chimed every time she reached for her phone to document the meal. Valerie, my mother, sat beside her, radiating the kind of proud, vicarious energy she reserved exclusively for Audrey's existence. I sat across from them, wearing a sensible wool blazer, quietly sipping my water, and trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. When the waiter finally approached our table, balancing a small, obligatory slice of chocolate cake with a single flickering candle, the conversation paused. I offered a polite smile, bracing myself for the usual strained chorus of happy birthday. Valerie did not sing. She did not even smile. She looked at the cake, then let her gaze travel slowly up to my blazer, her expression hardening into a familiar mask of disdain. She let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. The sound sliced cleanly through the ambient noise of the restaurant, sharper than any steak knife on the table. "You have always been the disappointment, Riley," she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't sound angry. She delivered the verdict with a casual, devastating certainty, as if she were commenting on the weather. "Not like your sister Valerie," continued, reaching over to pat Audrey's hand. Audrey has vision. She has drive. You just have jobs. Audrey smirked, adjusting a stray blonde curl and checking her reflection in the dark window glass. She didn't offer a defense. She bathed in the comparison. My father, Derek, sat beside me. He possessed the remarkable ability to simply vanish while remaining seated in a crowded room. At Valerie's words, he hunched his shoulders and focused intensely on cutting a perfectly square piece of sirloin. Derek was a man who preferred a quiet house over a just one. He chose complicity over conflict every single time. He would never defend me if it meant drawing Valerie's ire. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I let the insult sit on the white linen tablecloth between us, a heavy, ugly thing that we were all pretending was completely normal. I felt the familiar hollow ache of a daughter realizing yet again that she would never be enough. For years I had chased their validation. I had kept my head down, built a solid career, saved my money, and stayed out of trouble, hoping that one day the steady reliability of my life would earn a fraction of the pride Valerie showered on Audrey's chaotic fantasies. That night, looking at my mother's cold eyes, I finally understood it was a losing game. The waiter, sensing the sudden drop in temperature, quickly set the bill on the edge of the table and retreated. Valerie ignored it. Derek ignored it. Audrey picked up her phone and started scrolling, complaining loudly about her engagement metrics. I reached for the leather folio, placed my corporate card inside, and pushed it back toward the edge of the table. It was my birthday, and I was paying for the privilege of being insulted. As the waiter retrieved the folio, the conversation shifted back to Audrey's favorite subject, her impending financial crisis. I just do not know how I am going to fund the next quarter, Audrey whined, leaning back against the leather booth. The algorithm is burying my posts, and my credit cards are completely maxed out. I need a massive influx of capital for the new brand launch, or the whole thing is going to stall. Valerie laughed, a bright, trilling sound that felt entirely disconnected from the reality of Audrey's massive debt. She sipped her Pinot Noir, her eyes sparkling with malicious amusement. "Oh, do not worry about that, darling," Valerie said, waving a manicured hand dismissively. "Just use your sister's credit." The air in my lungs turned to ice. I set my water glass down, the condensation slipping through my fingers. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Valerie rolled her eyes, annoyed that I had interrupted her joke. "I am just saying, Riley, you have that boring, perfect credit score. You never do anything exciting with it. I still have that old power of attorney document you signed for us when you went off to college, just in case of emergencies. It is sitting right in my desk drawer." She leaned forward, conspiring with Audrey. "The banks never check if those things have been updated, you know. They just see the signature and approve the line. We could open a dozen accounts in Riley's name tomorrow, and she would never even know." She meant it as a joke, a cruel, flippant remark designed to highlight how dull and responsible my life was compared to Audrey's glamorous struggles. But as Valerie laughed, a cold, sharp dread settled into my bones. The casual disregard for my legal autonomy chilled me. They did not view me as a person with rights or boundaries. They viewed me as a utility, a backup generator they could plug into whenever Audrey's chaotic lifestyle blew a fuse. Derek finally looked up from his empty plate, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "Now, Valerie, do not tease your sister," he muttered, his voice lacking any real conviction. "Let us just keep the peace tonight." Keep the peace. It was his favorite phrase, the mantra that had defined my entire childhood. But peace in our family meant my total erasure. It meant I absorbed the insults, paid the bills, and stayed quiet while they rewrote reality to suit their needs. I looked at Valerie, her face flushed with wine and arrogance. I looked at Audrey, who was already typing furiously on her phone, calculating how much she could hypothetically extract from my pristine credit history. And I looked at Derek, who was already checking his watch, eager to escape the tension he refused to manage. They thought I was weak. They thought my silence was submission. They assumed I would always be the reliable, disappointing background character in the movie of Audrey's life. They had absolutely no idea that I was the operations manager for a prominent tech firm pulling down a mid-six-figure salary. They had no idea I owned my high-rise condo outright. And they certainly had no idea that Grandma Edith was waiting near the coat check, holding an envelope that was about to arm me with the kind of leverage that could crush their entire world. That night, listening to my mother joke about stealing my identity, the last lingering desire for her approval withered and died. I did not want their validation anymore. I wanted boundaries. And as I slid out of the booth, walking toward the lobby where Edith was waiting in the shadows, I realized that if they wanted to treat me like a utility, I was going to show them exactly what happens when the power gets cut off. The lobby of the restaurant smelled of damp wool, expensive floral perfumes, and the sharp tang of ozone from the storm raging outside. Valerie stood near the mahogany host stand berating a young attendant about the slow valet service. Her voice carried an entitled pitch that made nearby patrons avert their eyes and pretend to study the modern art hanging on the walls. Audrey hovered beside her, shivering theatrically in her thin silk dress, tapping her phone screen with sharp acrylic nails. They were so absorbed in their manufactured outrage that they did not notice Grandma Edith stepping away from the velvet ropes marking the cloakroom corridor. Edith was a woman carved from harder elements. While my mother and sister obsessed over fleeting trends and superficial social standing, my grandmother had spent her life managing vast agricultural plots in eastern Washington. She understood the unforgiving nature of a bad harvest, the heavy cost of maintaining a legacy, and the strict necessity of hard labor. Lately, her breathing had grown shallow. Her once relentless pace was slowed by a failing heart condition. My family treated her declining health like a minor scheduling conflict, a bothersome reality they preferred to ignore rather than address. They saw an old woman nearing the end of her usefulness. I saw the only person who had ever looked at me with clear, unclouded vision. As I waited for the attendant to retrieve my damp coat, a weathered hand reached out from the dim shadows. Edith gripped my wrist. Her fingers felt fragile, paper-thin over brittle bone, yet her hold possessed a startling, urgent strength. She stepped closer. The faint scent of lavender soap and old paper clung to her clothes, cutting through the heavy restaurant odors. Without saying a single word, she pressed a thick manila envelope into my open palm. A cold, heavy brass key rested on top of the coarse paper. Her pale blue eyes locked onto mine, fierce and surprisingly lucid. "Open this when you are alone," she whispered. Her voice was a raspy command that barely pierced the soft lobby jazz playing overhead. "And do not breathe a word of it to your mother." Before I could process the sudden weight in my hand or form a single question, Valerie turned sharply, her valet ticket fluttering in the cold draft blowing from the front doors. "Come on, Riley," Valerie snapped. Her patience entirely evaporated. "Stop dawdling! We are leaving." I slipped the envelope and the key deep into my coat pocket. The cold metal chilled my skin through the fabric lining. I offered Edith a brief, silent nod. She offered nothing back, simply turning her face toward the glass doors as the attendant finally brought our cars around. The drive back to my neighborhood was a solitary journey through a relentless Pacific Northwest storm. Rain lashed against the windshield, the wipers working frantically to clear the deluge. The rhythmic thud of the blades became a steady metronome, pulling my mind away from the neon streaks of the city and bringing me back to a blistering summer afternoon more than a decade ago. I was 16 years old, spending the month at Edith's property, far away from the stifling perfection of Valerie's suburban house. The heat in eastern Washington that July had been punishing, baking the earth until it cracked and turned the air hazy. Edith and I were walking the perimeter of an old horse pasture. I remembered the fine dust coating my sneakers and the sharp, earthy scent of dry sagebrush baking in the sun. We stopped beside a pristine section of fencing. The wood was painted a brilliant, flawless white, gleaming brightly under the open sky. It looked perfect, like a picturesque photograph from a country living magazine. I had complimented the craftsmanship, assuming it was a recent, expensive upgrade. Edith did not smile. Instead, she lifted a heavy leather work boot and kicked the base of the nearest post. The wood splintered instantly, revealing a hollow, decaying core heavily infested with rot. The pristine white paint flaked away in large chunks, exposing the ruin underneath. Never invest your time or your money in something just because it looks shiny on the outside. Riley, she had said, her voice dry and pragmatic. Paint is cheap. Anyone can slap a fresh coat on a dying piece of timber and call it new. Look at the foundation. If the roots are rotting, the whole structure will eventually collapse. Do not build your life on bad wood. That lesson had rooted itself deep in my chest. It represented the exact opposite of the doctrine Valerie enforced back home. My mother worshipped the shiny exterior. She funded Audrey's hollow aesthetic because she cared exclusively about how things appeared to the neighbors, the country club members, and the world at large. The foundation did not matter to Valerie, as long as the paint looked fresh and pristine. For years, I had watched them construct a glittering house of cards built on maxed-out credit lines and deep denial, while they treated my steady, unglamorous stability as a tragic character flaw. I steered my car off the wet, slicked highway and descended into the secure, heated underground garage of my downtown high-rise. The heavy steel gates closed behind me, shutting out the furious storm. My family believed I lived in a cramped, depressing apartment scraping by on a mediocre salary doing data entry. They were entirely oblivious to the reality of my career. As an operations manager for a major eco-logistics software firm, I handled complex supply chain algorithms and negotiated global vendor contracts on a daily basis. I possessed substantial equity in a company that was quietly reshaping the industry. My hidden income allowed me to purchase this penthouse outright, creating a private sanctuary suspended high above the city noise. I had never told them about the money or the title, because I knew Valerie would either demand a share to fund Audrey's lifestyle or find a way to belittle the achievement. I rode the private elevator up the quiet hum of the machinery, soothing my frayed nerves. Stepping into my foyer, the stark contrast between my true life and the false narrative my family forced upon me felt sharper than ever. The space was expansive, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the glittering Seattle skyline. I dropped my keys on a small console table and walked into the sprawling kitchen. The countertops were a sleek, flawless quartz, cold and immaculate under my fingertips. I reached into my damp coat pocket. My fingers brushed the cold brass key, tracing its jagged teeth before pulling it out along with the thick manila envelope. I laid both items carefully on the center of the kitchen island. The heavy, coarse paper looked entirely out of place against the modern, sterile stone. My heart beat a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I stood there in the quiet dark, the city lights painting faint geometric shadows across the hardwood floor, and stared at the unexpected gift. The embers of resentment, stoked by years of casual cruelty and tonight's blatant disrespect, began to glow with a new, intense heat. I was so incredibly tired of playing the reliable disappointment. I was exhausted from shrinking my accomplishments to make room for Audrey's delusions. Edith knew I possessed a solid foundation. She knew I could handle whatever truth was sealed inside that coarse paper. I reached out my fingertips, brushing the glued seal. I did not know it yet, but breaking that seal would trigger a chain reaction that would dismantle my mother's hollow empire piece by piece, starting with a revelation that would rewrite the rules of our entire family dynamic. I slid my thumbnail under the heavy glued flap of the manila envelope. The thick paper offered a brief, stubborn resistance before giving way with a sharp tearing sound that echoed in the quiet expanse of my kitchen. I turned the envelope upside down and let the contents slide out onto the pristine quartz counter. A folded piece of pale yellow stationery and a thick stack of stapled legal documents joined the heavy brass key. I reached for the stationery first. The paper felt slightly textured under my fingertips, carrying that same faint scent of lavender and dry dust I always associated with my grandmother. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. The strokes were slightly shaky, a testament to her failing health, but the pressure applied to the pen was deliberate and fierce. "Riley," the note began, "I have watched them shrink you for years. I have sat at those dinners and seen how your mother measures worth by the reflection in the mirror while ignoring the rot in the floorboards. Your mother values optics. I value resilience. You have built a quiet, solid life while they construct fantasies. This land is yours now. The income is yours alone. Do not let them take it. Build your fortress." I read the short paragraph twice. A tight, agonizing knot in my chest, a knot I had carried since childhood suddenly loosened. For 28 years, my entire existence had been defined by what I lacked in comparison to my sister. I lacked Audrey's superficial charm. I lacked her desperate need for the spotlight. I lacked my mother's ruthless vanity. But Edith had seen past the sensible blazers and the quiet demeanor. She had witnessed the endurance required to survive in a house that constantly demanded my erasure. She saw my resilience. She saw me. I set the letter aside, my vision blurring for a fraction of a second before I forced myself to focus on the legal packet. The top page was a warranty deed, fully executed, stamped, and notarized. I scanned the dense paragraphs of legal jargon, my background in corporate contract negotiation kicking in automatically. The grantor was listed as Edith's Living Trust. The grantee was Riley Long. The transfer had been finalized 3 weeks prior. I was the sole owner of a massive commercial tract located in the arid heart of eastern Washington. I frowned, slightly confused by the zoning designation listed on the second page. It was categorized as heavy commercial industrial, not agricultural. This was not the old horse pasture or the dusty apple orchards I remembered from my youth. I pulled my laptop from my work bag, flipped it open, and waited for the screen to illuminate the dark kitchen. I navigated to the county assessor's online database and typed in the long string of parcel numbers printed at the top of the deed. The search icon spun for a few seconds before the property record populated on the screen. I clicked on the satellite view, expecting to see a vast expanse of empty brown dirt or rows of dying crops. Instead, the screen filled with an enormous, sprawling industrial complex. Massive, flat, white roofs dominated the landscape, surrounded by high-security fencing and rows of colossal cooling units. My breath caught in my throat. I recognized the layout immediately. My eco-logistics software firm utilized similar infrastructure for cloud storage. This was not a farm. It was a data center hub. Eastern Washington possessed a unique geographic advantage. The arid climate, abundant space, and cheap hydroelectric power generated by the Columbia River made it a premier destination for global tech giants needing immense server farms. Edith had not given me an obsolete piece of agricultural history. She had handed me the keys to the digital future. I flipped to the back of the legal packet, finding a summary of the current lease agreements. The entire property was leased on a 99-year term to one of the largest software corporations on the planet. I traced my finger down the column of figures, my pulse pounding a frantic rhythm in my ears. The monthly lease revenue was staggering. It was an amount of money that eclipsed my own substantial corporate salary by an astronomical margin. The payments were being routed directly into an ironclad blind trust, completely shielded from public record, and more importantly, entirely protected from Valerie and Audrey. I closed the laptop and pushed it away. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound inside the penthouse, but my mind was roaring. In the span of a few minutes, my entire identity had violently shifted. I was no longer the disappointing daughter serving as a financial backup plan for a failing influencer. I was a commercial landlord to a multinational tech empire. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The Seattle storm raged on, throwing sheets of icy rain against the thick, reinforced glass. The water battered the window pane, frantic and relentless, trying to find a way inside. The storm felt exactly like my mother. Valerie was a force of constant, chaotic pressure, always demanding, always suffocating, forever trying to drown out anything that did not serve her immediate desires. But the glass held firm. The rain could not touch me in here. I pictured the landscape of eastern Washington in my mind, dry, sun-baked, expansive, and deeply rooted. It was an environment that survived on endurance rather than flash. It represented my new reality. Valerie and Audrey lived in a world of damp, fragile illusions where a single missed credit card payment could shatter their entire social standing. I possessed a fortress built on solid earth and digital infrastructure. The sheer scale of my newly acquired leverage settled over my shoulders heavy and incredibly grounding. If I wanted to, I could pay off Audrey's massive debts with a fraction of a single month's rent. I could buy Valerie the social adoration she craved. But doing so would only validate their cruelty. It would teach them that their strategy of diminishing me was ultimately profitable. I crossed my arms, watching the taillights of the cars far below blur into streaks of red on the wet pavement. Edith had given me this wealth because she trusted me to protect it. She knew I possessed the discipline to keep my mouth shut and let them reveal their true nature. I did not owe my family my silence, but I was going to use it as a weapon. The sudden shrill vibration of my cell phone on the quartz countertop shattered the quiet contemplation. I turned around. The screen illuminated the dark kitchen, displaying my sister's name in bright, glaring letters. It was well past midnight. Audrey never called me this late unless she was in a panic or needed a favor she was too arrogant to ask for properly. The emotional high of my discovery instantly cooled, replaced by a sharp, tactical awareness. Audrey was going to demand something outrageous, fueled by the wine and the toxic encouragement Valerie had fed her all evening. She was going to try and extract my resources to plug the holes in her sinking ship, completely unaware that I was standing on an untouchable island. I walked slowly back to the kitchen island, watching the phone vibrate against the stone. The trap was already set. All I had to do was answer the call and let her take the first step into the snare. I picked up the device and pressed the green button, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second before speaking. The sharp trill of my phone vibrating against the quartz countertop had pierced the quiet of my kitchen late last night, but I had let it ring out into silence. I knew Audrey's late-night tactics too well. A midnight call was designed to catch me off guard, to leverage exhaustion against my better judgment. I had simply turned the screen face down, left the thick manila envelope resting exactly where it was, and walked away to get my first genuine night of sleep in years. When the device lit up again the following morning, the Seattle storm had finally broken. Pale sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, crisp shadows across the hardwood floors of my penthouse. I stood by the espresso machine, watching the dark liquid pull into a ceramic cup, feeling grounded and steady. The deed to the Eastern Washington data center sat on the island, a silent anchor tethering me to my new reality. The caller ID flashed my sister's name again. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee, tapped the green icon, and lifted the phone to my ear. "Riley, you ignored me last night," Audrey began. "No hello, no inquiry about how the rest of my birthday went, just the immediate, sharp sting of an accusation." "I was asleep," I replied, my tone flat and unyielding. "Whatever. Listen, I am in a major time crunch." Audrey spoke with a breathless, frantic energy, the kind she always adopted when she wanted to steamroll a conversation before the other person could think critically. "I am officially launching my new eco-lifestyle brand next month. The invites are ready to go out, but the venue is being ridiculous about securing the date. I need you to cover the deposit. It is $15,000. Just wire it to my business account by noon." She rattled off the instructions not as a request, but as an expected tax for existing in her orbit. The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the quiet air of my kitchen. Audrey's much-hyped eco-lifestyle brand was a masterclass in superficiality. For months, she had been teasing her followers with curated mood boards featuring sage green color palettes and minimalist fonts. But I had seen the supplier invoices she carelessly left on Valerie's dining table during my last visit. The products were nothing more than cheap synthetic goods drop-shipped from overseas factories, rebranded with beige labels and marked up 1,000%. There was nothing ecological about it. It was a desperate cash grab designed to fund her designer wardrobe and maintain the illusion of success. I leaned against the counter, my eyes tracing the official notary stamp on Grandma Edith's deed. In the past, a demand like this would have sent a familiar spike of anxiety straight through my chest. I would have instinctively opened my banking app, calculating how much I could pull from my savings without crippling my own financial security. I would have justified the expense as a necessary sacrifice to avoid the inevitable tantrums and the crushing weight of my mother's weaponized disappointment. Valerie would have praised my generosity for exactly one evening before reverting to treating me like an invisible nuisance. But this morning, the old anxiety was entirely absent. The invisible strings they had used to manipulate me for nearly 3 decades had been severed by a single stroke of Edith's pen. "I do not have $15,000 to fund a launch party, Audrey," I said. A sharp exhale crackled through the speaker. Audrey was not used to hearing the word no, especially not from me. "I am not asking you to fund a party, Riley." She snapped her voice, pitching higher, threading the needle between irritation and desperation. "I am asking you to invest in my brand. It is a rooftop garden event downtown. The aesthetics are crucial for the angel investors. Mom said you could afford it. She said you have been hoarding your salary from that boring logistics job and that you owe it to the family to support my vision." The invocation of our mother's name was a calculated strike. Audrey always used Valerie as a shield and a battering ram, knowing that displeasing one meant facing the wrath of both. Valerie had casually offered up my bank account, just as she had joked about using my pristine credit score the night before. They truly believed my resources were community property waiting to be harvested whenever Audrey's chaotic choices caught up with her. "I am not an angel investor," I replied, keeping my voice remarkably even. The coffee warmed my hands, a stark contrast to the cold detachment settling into my chest. "And I am not writing a check for a venue deposit. You need to scale back your plans or find the capital somewhere else." The line went dead quiet for 3 long seconds. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head, the shock morphing rapidly into venom. "This is exactly why Mom gets so frustrated with you," Audrey sneered, dropping the frantic businesswoman persona and reverting to the cruel older sister. "You are so rigid and unsupportive. I am trying to build a legacy here, and you cannot even step up to help your own flesh and blood. You just sit in your little apartment and judge me because you do not have an ounce of creativity or ambition." The insults were meant to wound, to trigger my deep-seated need for their approval. She wanted me to scramble to apologize, to offer the money just to prove I was not the bitter, unsupportive sibling she was painting me to be. But her words fell flat against the armor of my new reality. I looked out the window at the Seattle skyline, thinking of the sprawling, dry plains and the hum of the server farms hundreds of miles away. I had built a legacy. I just had not built it for them. "You are entitled to your opinion, Audrey," I said softly. "Do not patronize me," she hissed. "Just transfer the funds. I will pay you back when the seed money comes in. I promise." We both knew that was a lie. There was no seed money. There were no legitimate investors. There was only the endless gaping void of her entitlement, a black hole that would swallow every dollar I earned and still demand more. "No, Audrey," I said. The word felt unfamiliar on my tongue, but it carried a profound, heavy weight. "I am not giving you the money. Do not ask me again." Before she could launch into another tirade, before she could scream or cry or threaten to call Valerie, I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button. The call disconnected. I placed the device back onto the quartz counter. The silence that followed was not the suffocating tension of the restaurant from the night before. It was the expansive, ringing silence of a broken chain. I took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling my lungs with refreshing clarity. It was my first real boundary. I had finally stopped playing the game. But as I stood there in the morning light, the tactical part of my brain, the part that negotiated ruthless corporate contracts, began to analyze the board. Audrey was backed into a corner. She had already mailed the invitations for a lavish event she could not afford. Her digital facade was crumbling, and the pressure to maintain the illusion was immense. She needed $15,000 immediately, and she had just been denied by her most reliable funding source. Valerie would not let her golden child fail publicly. My mother would view my refusal not as a boundary, but as an act of treason. They were going to retaliate, and they were going to do it quickly. If they could not extract the funds from me through guilt and manipulation, they would look for a back door. My mind flashed back to the cruel joke Valerie had made over birthday cake. The casual mention of an outdated power of attorney sitting in a desk drawer. The snare was set, and I knew with chilling certainty that my sister and mother were arrogant into it. They were about to make a catastrophic financial misstep, but first, they would send my father to try and force my compliance. The midday sun glared against the soundproof glass of my corner office, casting bright geometric patterns across my desk. My computer screen displayed a complex array of global shipping algorithms and vendor contracts, a silent testament to the lucrative career my family refused to acknowledge. My desk phone remained quiet, but my personal cell vibrated against the polished mahogany surface, disrupting the focused calm of my afternoon. The caller identification displayed my father's name. Derek rarely initiated contact. He preferred to let my mother handle all communications, acting as a passive observer in his own life. Answering his call meant engaging with the designated peacekeeper of the family, a role he executed not by resolving conflicts, but by demanding total submission from whoever was easiest to bend. In this family, that person had always been me. I tapped the green icon and brought the device to my ear, bracing myself for the inevitable pressure. "Riley, you really upset your sister," he began. His tone lacked any greeting or warmth. He deployed a heavy, disappointed sigh, a sound he had perfected over decades of avoiding genuine confrontation. I heard the faint rustle of a newspaper in the background, signaling that he was multitasking, not even giving this conversation his full attention. "She has been crying all morning. Your mother is furious. You need to apologize and write the check. Just keep the peace." I stared at the shipping metrics on my monitor. Keep the peace. It was his universal solution to every crisis Valerie or Audrey manufactured. Derek worked as a mid-level actuary at a regional insurance firm, a man who spent his days calculating risk and his evenings avoiding it entirely. He knew Audrey was acting entitled. He knew $15,000 was an unreasonable demand to place on a sibling. But he also knew that if I did not pay the ransom, Valerie would make his home environment unbearable. He was willing to sacrifice my financial security to ensure his weekend remained quiet. "I am not writing a check, Dad," I replied. My voice remained steady, devoid of the familiar panic that used to accompany their demands. "I cannot fund her business venture. She needs to find another way." A long, tense silence stretched across the cellular connection. He was waiting for me to cave, expecting the lifelong conditioning of guilt to take over. When I did not yield, his disappointment morphed into genuine disgust. "You have a steady paycheck, Riley," he muttered, his voice tightening with suppressed anger. "It would not kill you to help your flesh and blood." "You are being unreasonable. Do not make this a whole thing. Just transfer the funds today." He framed my financial independence as a weapon I was wielding against them, rather than a boundary I was enforcing for my own survival. I realized in that specific moment that Derek was not a victim of Valerie's tyranny. He was her most effective enabler. His complicity was a choice, a calculated decision to throw me under the bus so he would not have to deal with the wreckage. "I will not discuss this further," I stated, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Fine," he snapped. He disconnected the call abruptly. The sharp click resonated in my ear, a definitive severing of the last frayed thread of respect I held for him. He had chosen his side, confirming that his love was entirely conditional upon my usefulness. 24 hours later, the retaliation shifted from passive-aggressive phone calls to open psychological warfare. I was in the middle of reviewing a quarterly earnings report when a new voicemail notification popped up on my screen. It was Valerie. I pressed play, expecting another tirade about Audrey's venue deposit. Instead, my mother's voice dripped with a toxic, gleeful sympathy. "Oh, Riley," she cooed, the fake concern coating her words like cheap syrup over spoiled fruit. "I just opened a very alarming piece of mail that arrived at the house for you. It is from the Internal Revenue Service. It looks like you are being audited. They're demanding payment for an old tax return. I always told you to be careful with those mediocre little office jobs. They never handle the paperwork right. Audrey and I are just so worried about you. Let us know if you need to borrow a few dollars for groceries this week." She ended the recording with a sharp, triumphant laugh before the line cut out. The audacity was breathtaking. Opening mail addressed to another adult was a federal offense, but Valerie considered the law a mild suggestion that did not apply to her. She had invaded my privacy and immediately weaponized the findings to reassert her dominance. She desperately needed me to be failing so she could feel superior. A brief flash of concern prickled the back of my neck. I immediately dialed my certified public accountant, a brilliant, ruthless woman named Zara, who handled the complex tax structures of my corporate equity and my newly acquired commercial real estate trust. I relayed the voicemail to her, keeping my voice level. Zara accessed my digital files while we spoke, the rapid clacking of her keyboard echoing over the speaker. "Do not panic," Zara advised, her tone crisp and professional. "It is a routine automated inquiry regarding a minor deduction discrepancy from 3 years ago. The amount in question is less than $200. I will electronically submit the amended schedule form right now. The entire issue will be resolved in 5 minutes. You have nothing to worry about. Riley, your accounts are pristine." I thanked her and ended the call. The tension drained from my shoulders, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. The letter was a red herring. It meant nothing to my actual financial standing. But to Valerie and Audrey, it was undeniable proof that my life was unraveling. They believed I was broke, struggling, and terrified of the federal government. My initial instinct was to call Valerie, demand she stop tampering with my correspondence, and inform her that my finances were more than secure. I wanted to throw my success in her face, to shatter her condescending illusions with the reality of my Eastern Washington property and my corporate salary. I wanted to hear the shock in her voice. But I stopped my hand before it could dial her number. I looked out the window at the gray Seattle skyline, remembering Grandma Edith's warning about shiny exteriors and rotting foundations. If I corrected Valerie, if I proved my stability, she would immediately pivot back to demanding the venue deposit. She would view my wealth as an untapped resource belonging to the family, a fresh well to pump dry. But if I let her believe the lie, if I allowed her to think I was a financial liability facing a devastating audit, she would drop me entirely. She would view me as a dead end. I chose silence. I did not return her call. I did not send a text message defending myself. I let the false narrative take root in their minds, cultivating a potent illusion of my vulnerability. Sometimes the most effective strategy in dealing with a toxic opponent is simply letting them believe they have already won. By the end of the week, the silence from my parents' house was deafening. They stopped calling. They stopped asking for favors. Their complacency settled over them like a thick, heavy blanket. They felt victorious, secure in the knowledge that their golden child was still the superior investment, while the disappointing daughter was drowning in bureaucratic debt. Their arrogance blinded them to the reality of my actual wealth. Because they believed I was useless and distracted by an impending tax crisis, Valerie realized she could no longer extract the $15,000 from my bank account through guilt or coercion. But Audrey still needed the capital for her launch party. The venue deadline was approaching fast, and the pressure to maintain their digital facade was reaching a boiling point. The eco-lifestyle brand was Audrey's entire identity, and Valerie would not allow her favorite child to experience public failure. Valerie decided to take matters into her own hands. She needed a rapid influx of cash, and she knew she could not use her own compromised credit history to secure it. As I sat in my penthouse, reviewing the soaring revenue reports from my data center, my mother walked into her home office. She opened her bottom desk drawer and pulled out the outdated power of attorney document I had signed nearly a decade ago. Believing I was too broke to notice and too weak to fight back, she prepared to cross a legal boundary that would change everything, stepping blindly into a catastrophic trap she was building entirely by herself. 7 days passed since the fabricated tax audit letter arrived at my mother's house. A full week of profound, unbroken silence from my family. I spent those days operating in a state of hyper-focused calm, closing quarter-end metrics for the logistics firm and reviewing the latest yield reports from my commercial real estate trust. The distance they gave me felt like a rare gift, a brief respite from the constant psychological warfare. I should have known the quiet was merely the receding tide before a devastating tsunami. It was a Tuesday morning. The Seattle sky hung low and bruised, spitting a fine, freezing mist against the reinforced glass of my penthouse windows. I sat at the quartz kitchen island, a cup of dark roast coffee steaming beside my open laptop. I was reviewing a routine vendor contract when my personal cell phone illuminated. A high-priority notification pushed through my lock screen, distinct from the usual email chimes or calendar reminders. It was an alert from my premium identity monitoring service, a robust digital security measure I maintained precisely because of my corporate equity. The text read, "New commercial credit account established. Action required." My fingers hovered over the keyboard, suddenly rigid. I did not possess any commercial credit lines outside of the impenetrable corporate structures my accountant managed. A cold, heavy dread pooled in the base of my stomach, a primal instinct warning me that my carefully guarded perimeter had been breached. I picked up the device, authenticated my login with a thumbprint, and waited for the application dashboard to load on the screen. The page refreshed. A bold, red graphic displayed a newly approved small business loan. The principal amount sat glaringly at the top of the digital summary. $150,000. My breath hitched, catching sharply in my throat. I set the coffee mug down so hard the dark liquid sloshed over the ceramic rim, staining the pristine white stone counter. I clicked the portal link to expand the account details, my eyes scanning the dense rows of financial data with mounting horror. The primary applicant was a registered limited liability company. It was Audrey's eco-lifestyle brand. The lender was not a traditional brick-and-mortar institution. It was an aggressive online fintech entity, a shadow bank, known for rapid approvals, exorbitant interest rates, and a notorious habit of bypassing standard protocol. They did not require in-person verification or notarized physical identification. They only required a digital application and a guarantor with an impeccable financial history to shoulder the immense risk of the loan. I scrolled down to the guarantor section. My name stared back at me in stark, black font. Riley Long. My current residential address was listed alongside my social security number and my pristine credit score. I navigated to the document repository and downloaded the finalized loan agreement. My hands felt strangely detached, numb, and stiff as I dragged the cursor down to the final page containing the authorization signatures. There it was. My signature. It was a remarkably well-practiced forgery. At a passing glance, it looked legitimate, but studying it closely under the bright white screen of my laptop, I saw the telltale signs of my mother's penmanship. The sharp, aggressive slant of the capital letters, the unnatural hesitations in the looping cursive, the heavy pressure applied at the end of the surname. Valerie had actually done it. She had crossed the line from toxic emotional manipulation into severe criminality. The jokes she made at my birthday dinner echoed in the quiet kitchen. She had brazenly announced her intentions over expensive wine and chocolate cake, laughing in my face while she plotted. She retained that outdated power of attorney document I had signed nearly a decade ago. It was a standard form executed when I was a terrified college freshman, moving into a dorm designed strictly for medical emergencies or tuition processing. I had forgotten it even existed. Valerie had weaponized it, uploading a scanned copy of that ancient document to the predatory lender's automated portal, bypassing the need for my direct consent. They needed an influx of capital to fund Audrey's fraudulent launch party, and they needed it immediately. Valerie calculated the risk and decided I was an acceptable casualty. She operated under the arrogant assumption that I would never discover the loan, or if the automated notices somehow reached me, she believed my fabricated tax problems would keep me too terrified and distracted to investigate properly. She assumed I was busy fighting an IRS audit, blind to the knife she was twisting into my back. More importantly, Valerie banked on a lifetime of psychological conditioning. She assumed that even if I caught her red-handed, I would be too paralyzed by the fear of destroying the family reputation to hold her accountable. She thought I would absorb the $150,000 debt just to keep the peace, stepping back into my role as the reliable, disappointing daughter who silently cleans up their messes. The panic that initially seized my chest evaporated. It did not fade slowly. It vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a profound, icy clarity. The ambient noise of the city traffic far below seemed to mute itself. The adrenaline rushing through my veins felt remarkably different today. It was not the desperate, anxious energy of a victim trying to survive an attack. It was the calculated, sharp focus of a predator watching its prey step willingly into a steel snare. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a venue deposit or a petty battle for parental validation. This was identity theft. It was wire fraud. It was a Class B felony carrying severe federal penalties. By forging my signature, my mother and sister had not just insulted my existence. They had legally handed me the exact mechanism of their own destruction. They had handed me the rope, tied the noose, and placed it around their own necks. I closed the digital document and leaned back against the leather counterstool. My mind mapped the inevitable trajectory of Audrey's business. Her brand was built on cheap inventory and fake social media engagement. It possessed zero actual revenue streams. She would burn through the principal loan amounts in a matter of months, prioritizing lavish rooftop parties, expensive catering, and superficial marketing campaigns. When the capital ran dry, the shadow bank would come looking for their monthly payments, and when Audrey defaulted, the aggressive collection agencies would legally pivot their cross-hunt to the guarantor. Me. If I allowed this to play out without intervention, they could potentially place liens against my penthouse and my Eastern Washington Data Center Trust. My entire fortress could be compromised by their blinding incompetence. The logical immediate response would be to dial the local police precinct. I could file an identity theft report, freeze the credit line, and let the detectives knock on Valerie's front door. But a police investigation is a messy public affair. It moves slowly, bogged down by bureaucracy and endless delays. Furthermore, involving local authorities would give Valerie the opportunity to spin a narrative. She would cry, hire a defense attorney, claim it was a familial misunderstanding, and paint me as a vindictive, unstable daughter attacking her own mother over a paperwork error. I refused to give her a stage. I refused to let her control the narrative or weaponize her tears. I wanted the fallout to be swift, silent, and structurally devastating. I needed absolute leverage, the kind that does not require a police badge to enforce. I needed a trap so tight she would not realize she was caught until the steel teeth snapped shut. I picked up my cell phone and bypassed the emergency numbers. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the direct line to my corporate attorney. His name was Harrison, a man who possessed a formidable reputation for orchestrating ruthless, unassailable legal strategies. He handled the complex acquisition of my tech company equity and structured the ironclad blind trusts protecting my commercial real estate. He did not deal in emotions. He dealt in pure leverage and irreversible consequences. I pressed the call icon and brought the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone ring out into the quiet penthouse. The storm outside continued to spit freezing rain against the glass, but inside my fortress, the climate was entirely under my control. My mother thought she was outsmarting the system, playing a clever game of financial chess while utilizing my pieces. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that I already owned the board, and I was about to rewrite the rules permanently. Harrison answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and alert despite the early hour. He did not waste time with pleasantries, and neither did I. "We have a critical situation," I told him, keeping my voice steady and cold. I need you to pull the digital access logs and forensic tracking data for a newly originated commercial loan. My identity has been compromised by a family member. I am going to need a full prosecution packet assembled by the end of the week, and we need to structure a quiet acquisition of the debt before the lender realizes the guarantor's signature is fraudulent. I paused, looking at the brass key Grandma Edith had given me resting beside the coffee mug. They wanted my credit, I said softly into the receiver. Let us see how they handle my collections. Before executing the legal strike against my mother, I needed to stand on the ground that Grandma Edith had given me. I needed to see the physical manifestation of my new reality. Early Friday morning, I packed a small overnight bag, left my Seattle penthouse, and steered my car toward the Cascade Mountains. The drive served as a geographical cleansing. The relentless gray drizzle of the city gradually surrendered as the elevation climbed. I navigated the steep, winding highway passes, watching the dense, weeping evergreens thin out, giving way to the stark, beautiful desolation of the rain shadow. By the time I descended into the Columbia River Basin, the environment had entirely transformed. The sky opened up into an endless, blinding blue canopy. The air flowing through the climate control vents felt crisp and arid, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and sun-baked sagebrush. This was the landscape of endurance. It was a place that did not tolerate fragile illusions or superficial appearances. My navigation system guided me away from the traditional agricultural routes and down a newly paved industrial corridor. I expected to find a modest administrative building surrounded by a few metal racks. Instead, I arrived at a high-security perimeter. Tall chain-link fences topped with angled wire stretched across the Golden Plains, enclosing an enormous compound. Several sprawling, windowless structures dominated the acreage, painted a stark, reflective white to deflect the punishing summer heat. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking. Even from the perimeter road, I could hear the steady, low-frequency hum of thousands of industrial cooling fans working to prevent the processors from overheating. It sounded like the rhythmic breathing of a sleeping giant. This was not just a piece of commercial real estate. It was a digital fortress. I pulled up to the reinforced steel security gates and lowered my window. A uniformed guard stepped out of the booth, his expression strictly professional. I handed him my identification. The moment he scanned the name Riley Long, his posture shifted. The standard polite indifference vanished, replaced by immediate, profound deference. He nodded sharply, pressed a button on his console, and the heavy gates glided open without a single question. I parked in a designated executive space near the main administrative hub. The site director was already waiting for me at the glass entrance. He was a middle-aged professional wearing a sharp-tailored suit that looked entirely out of place in the desert heat. He extended his hand, greeting me with a level of deep respect I had never experienced from anyone in my own bloodline. We walked through the secure corridors, our footsteps echoing against the polished concrete floors. He led me into a pristine boardroom overlooking the sprawling complex. Spread across the long mahogany table were several thick leather binders containing the operational metrics and the finalized legal contracts. Your grandmother was a remarkable visionary, the director noted, sliding the primary portfolio toward my chair. She secured this zoning decades before the technology sector realized the geographical value of this region. We are thrilled to continue our partnership with your trust. I opened the binder. The top document was a 10-year corporate lease renewal, fully executed and ready for my countersignature. I scanned the terms, my eyes landing on the printed name of the tenant organization. A very familiar, globally recognized logo sat embossed in the upper corner of the parchment. It belonged to one of the most powerful software corporations on the planet. I stared at that logo, a slow, cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. The dramatic irony of the situation was exquisite. A piece of poetic justice so perfect, It almost felt scripted. Just yesterday evening, I had watched my sister perform her daily digital routine. Audrey had launched a live stream from her meticulously staged living room, holding up one of her repackaged beige candles. She spent 20 minutes delivering a desperate, rehearsed monologue, tagging the official corporate accounts of this exact software giant. She was pleading with their marketing department for a micro-sponsorship, hoping to secure a few $100s and some free exposure to legitimize her eco-brand. My sibling was out there begging for digital table scraps, degrading herself for pennies and a temporary social media boost. She viewed those corporate executives as untouchable deities who held the keys to her success. Meanwhile, the board of directors for that very same tech empire had just authorized a multi-million-dollar wire transfer to my private trust simply to keep their infrastructure resting on my dirt. Audrey was groveling to the people who paid me rent. The contrast between her manufactured desperation and my silent, untouchable power settled deep into my bones. The leverage I held was profound. It went far beyond the forged small business loan or the toxic birthday insults. I owned the ground beneath the empire she worshipped. I signed the renewal documents, the ink flowing smoothly across the heavy paper. The director thanked me profusely, promising to send the updated revenue schedules to my accountant by the end of the day. I walked back to my car, the desert sun warming my shoulders. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled my cell phone from my purse. The screen illuminated, displaying the contact information for the fraud department at the predatory online lender. All I had to do was press the green icon, report the unauthorized account, and the $150,000 credit line would freeze instantly. The shadow bank would lock the funds, the venue deposit would bounce, and the brand launch would crumble before it even began. My thumb hovered over the screen. If I stopped the transaction right now, my mother and sister would panic, but they would survive. They would play the victim blame a clerical error and pivot to another desperate scheme. Valerie would cry on the phone to my father, claiming the universe was simply unfair to her golden child. They would learn nothing. They would escape the consequences of their felony by hiding behind their favorite shield of plausible deniability. I lowered the phone, placing it in the cup holder. I did not want them to escape. I wanted them to experience the full, unmitigated weight of their arrogance. To dismantle their delusion permanently, they needed to believe they had won. They needed to access the stolen capital and spend it recklessly. I wanted them to sign the ironclad contracts with the downtown venue, book the expensive caterers, and pay the event planners. I needed them to construct their house of cards as high as possible, pouring every single dollar of that fraudulent loan into a hollow, extravagant party. I was not going to freeze the account. I was going to let the transaction clear. I would let them stand at the very top of their fragile tower, basking in the false glory of a success built entirely on my stolen identity. Because the higher they built their fantasy, the harder the impact would be when I finally pulled the foundation out from underneath them. I started the engine, the low hum of my vehicle blending with the sound of the server cooling fans in the distance. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the countdown to their financial ruin had officially begun. I steered the car out of the compound, leaving the digital fortress behind, and began the long drive back to Seattle. It was time to watch them burn through the cash, setting the stage for a confrontation they could never talk their way out of. The skyline of Seattle was shrouded in a thick layer of charcoal clouds as I stepped into the glass-enclosed conference room of Harrison's downtown law firm. The environment was sterile, quiet, and ruthlessly efficient. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic, emotional minefield my family forced me to navigate on a daily basis. Harrison sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable. Beside him sat Zara, my certified public accountant, a woman who possessed a lethal talent for forensic auditing. We were not here to draft a polite cease and desist letter. We were here to build a weapon. Our initial strategy had involved quietly acquiring the fraudulent debt from the predatory online lender, but Harrison quickly advised against that maneuver. Purchasing a freshly issued performing commercial loan would trigger mandatory internal compliance audits at the fintech company. It would raise immediate red flags, potentially prompting the lender to contact the guarantor for secondary verification. We needed the shadow bank to remain entirely oblivious to the forgery. We needed the trap to assemble itself in perfect, unbroken silence without startling the prey. Instead of buying the debt, we constructed a prosecution packet. Sarah slid a thick black binder across the smooth table, flipping it open to reveal a staggering digital paper trail. It was a masterpiece of documented incompetence. My mother believed the internet was a magical void that swallowed secrets without a trace. Sarah proved it was wet cement, capturing every single footprint and preserving it forever. The loan application was submitted on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah tapped a manicured finger against a printed spreadsheet. The Internet Protocol address logged by the shadow bank tied directly to the wireless router sitting in Valerie's suburban living room. We had the exact timestamp down to the second, matching a window of time when Derek was at his insurance office and Audrey was at a local salon. Harrison turned to the next tab, revealing a high-resolution scan of the power of attorney document Valerie had uploaded to the lender portal. He pointed out the notary stamp. It was nearly a decade old, bearing the signature of a clerk from my university town. He explained the strict legal mechanics of wire fraud across state lines. Because the online lender was headquartered in Delaware, the digital transmission of fraudulent documents elevated the crime from a state-level issue to a federal jurisdiction matter. Sarah mapped the subsequent capital flow, laying out the ledgers with clinical precision. $150,000 hit the limited liability company account on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the blatant embezzlement began. The stolen funds were not utilized for sustainable inventory warehouse space or ecological research. Tens of thousands were wired directly to an upscale downtown event space to secure the rooftop terrace. Another large sum vanished into a luxury catering service known for charging exorbitant premiums for organic appetizers. Several $1,000s were transferred to high-end retail boutiques. Audrey was rapidly draining the commercial credit line to purchase designer shoes, imported caviar, and extravagant floral arrangements that would wilt in a day. Harrison closed the binder. The heavy thud of the leather cover echoed sharply in the quiet room. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his posture losing its usual corporate polish. He looked at me with a stark, unblinking gravity. "Riley," he began, his voice quiet and deadly serious. "This is no longer a civil family dispute over a mismanaged credit card. We have established clear, undeniable proof of identity theft and federal wire fraud. If we submit this prosecution packet to the district attorney, your mother will face severe criminal charges. The federal minimum sentencing guidelines for these offenses are unforgiving. There is no coming back from this action. If I hand this over, she will go to prison." He needed to know I possessed the stomach for the execution. He needed confirmation that I would not waver when the reality of the consequences set in, that I would not succumb to the lifelong conditioning of protecting my parents at my own expense. I looked at the black binder resting on the table. I thought about the birthday dinner, the casual, cruel jokes about stealing my future, the endless years of being treated as a disposable utility. I thought about Grandma Edith kicking the rotting fence post, warning me not to build a life on decaying wood. I looked back at Harrison, meeting his intense gaze without a fraction of hesitation. I know I said, seal the packet, keep it ready in your safe. 2 weeks passed. The evening of Audrey's highly anticipated brand launch finally arrived. I sat on the Italian leather sofa in my penthouse, a glass of sparkling water resting in my hand, casting my cell phone screen onto the large television mounted on the wall. I did not need an invitation to attend the event. The entire spectacle was broadcast live across a dozen social media channels, documented by local influencers hoping to capture some of the manufactured glamour. The downtown rooftop had been transformed into a faux ecological paradise. Lush rented foliage draped over the iron railings, masking the concrete architecture of the city. Soft amber string lights hung suspended above the crowd, creating a warm, cinematic glow that looked perfect on camera. Waiters in crisp linen uniforms circulated with silver trays, handing out expensive hors d'oeuvres and signature cocktails garnished with edible flowers. It looked like $1 million success story, a triumphant entrepreneurial debut. Audrey held the center stage. She wore a custom silk gown that likely cost more than a reliable used vehicle. She spun for the flashing cameras, holding up her cheap drop-shipped candles, delivering practiced, earnest monologues about sustainability and mindful living. Her digital followers flooded the comment sections with praise, entirely blind to the toxic reality funding the aesthetics. She spoke about ethical sourcing and environmental responsibility, a profound hypocrisy considering the entire venture was financed by committing a felony against her own sister. But my focus quickly shifted away from my sibling and settled on the background of the video feed. Valerie was maneuvering through the crowd of minor socialites and wealthy patrons. She wore a tailored designer suit, holding a crystal flute of imported champagne. Her smile was blinding, radiating a toxic, triumphant energy. She was actively taking credit for the lavish display, accepting compliments from the guests, absorbing their admiration like a dry sponge. She leaned into the cameras, posing for photographs, looking so incredibly proud of the empire she was helping to build. She was celebrating a superficial fantasy constructed entirely on my stolen identity. Watching them toast to their fake success, I felt a profound, chilling calm wash over me. The resentment that used to burn in my chest was gone, replaced by the clinical detachment of a spectator watching a tragedy unfold. They were dancing under a legal guillotine. The blade was razor-sharp, forged from undeniable forensic evidence and federal statutes. It hung suspended by a single frayed thread that I held gently between my fingertips. They were entirely oblivious to the danger lingering just inches above their necks. Every sip of champagne, every rented orchid, every boastful social media post they uploaded added another heavy weight to the inevitable crash. But Valerie's arrogance could never contain itself to a single evening. The taste of high society praise was an addictive narcotic, and the launch party elevated her confidence to dangerous new heights. She felt invincible. As quiet whispers of my own actual corporate success began to slowly leak into her prestigious social circles, she could not resist the urge to intertwine our narratives. She needed to claim ownership of everything around her. She was about to make a fatal public miscalculation, setting the stage for a Sunday brunch confrontation that would shatter her carefully curated image in front of the exact audience she worshipped most. Seattle possesses a distinct social hierarchy, one built less on generational bloodlines and more on the quiet accumulation of corporate equity. Valerie worshipped this caste system. Her entire identity was anchored to her membership at the Oak Ridge Country Club, an exclusive enclave nestled in the wealthy suburbs just east of the city. For my mother, the club was not merely a recreational facility. It was her sanctuary, her courtroom, and her stage. She spent her Sundays there, draped in cashmere, holding court over brunch with a circle of women who traded gossip like high-value currency. To maintain her standing among these wives of executives and surgeons, Valerie had spent years weaving an intricate tapestry of lies. She painted our family as a flawless portrait of suburban success. Audrey was the brilliant entrepreneur, and I was the humble, quiet daughter working a simple desk job kept afloat by my parents' generous guidance. It was a narrative designed to make Valerie look like a benevolent matriarch. But the tech industry in the Pacific Northwest is an insular community. Secrets rarely stay buried, especially when corporate quarterlies are published. A week after Audrey threw her fraudulent launch event, my eco-logistics firm released a public report detailing a highly profitable merger. My name appeared in the executive summary, listed clearly as a primary shareholder and the director of operations who spearheaded the negotiation. It did not take long for the digital breadcrumbs to cross paths with the Oak Ridge rumor mill. A husband working in venture capital mentioned the report to his wife, who promptly carried the revelation straight to the Sunday brunch tables. I did not plan the collision. I was not there to hunt my mother down. I visited Oak Ridge that Sunday morning strictly for business. A prominent supply chain client, a man who preferred negotiating over poached eggs rather than inside a sterile boardroom, had invited me to the club dining room. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my hair pulled back, carrying a leather portfolio. We sat at a corner table near the floor-to-ceiling windows, discussing automated freight routes and international tariffs. As my client paused to review a printed contract, my gaze drifted across the expansive dining room. The space hummed with the polite clatter of silverware against fine china and the low murmur of privileged conversations. 3 tables away, situated perfectly beneath a cascading crystal chandelier, sat Valerie. She was surrounded by her usual audience of 4 wealthy peers. They were leaning in their mimosas, resting on the white linen tablecloth, hanging onto her every word. The acoustics of the high vaulted ceiling possessed a strange quality, carrying fragments of sound across the room. One of the women, a sharp-featured socialite named Patricia, raised her glass toward my mother. Her voice, bright and inquisitive, sliced through the ambient noise. "I heard the most fascinating news about your youngest daughter, Patricia," chirped. "My husband mentioned Riley was named in that big logistics merger this week. He said her equity position is staggering. You always played down her little office job, but she is practically a tech mogul. You must be bursting with pride." A lesser woman might have stumbled, caught off guard by the sudden exposure of a truth she had actively suppressed. But Valerie was a master of improvisation. She did not skip a beat. She set her champagne flute down with elegant precision, offering a warm, modest smile that could have won an acting award. "Oh, Patricia, we are just thrilled for her," my mother crooned, her voice dripping with maternal affection. "It has been a long journey, but we always knew Riley had potential. She could not have achieved any of it without our early investments, of course. Derek and I provided the seed capital for her education and her initial portfolios. We set her up perfectly. We prefer to keep her successes quiet so Audrey does not feel overshadowed. But yes, our financial guidance really paved the way for Riley." The sheer brazen nature of the lie stopped the breath in my lungs. She had not contributed a single dollar to my university tuition. She had never offered a shred of financial guidance, let alone seed capital. She had drained their savings to fund Audrey's delusions, leaving me to navigate student loans and corporate ladders entirely on my own. And now, sitting in her prestigious sanctuary, she was effortlessly rewriting history to claim ownership of my silent, grueling labor. I excused myself from my client, citing a brief need to stretch my legs. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal jacket, and walked slowly toward the chandelier. My footsteps were muffled by the plush patterned carpet. I did not rush. I let the anticipation settle into my bones, replacing the old familiar hurt with a cold, unyielding resolve. I reached the edge of their table just as Valerie was launching into another fabricated anecdote about how she taught me to read stock tickers. She was so absorbed in her own performance that she did not notice my shadow falling across her porcelain plate. "Hello, Mom," I said. My voice was not loud, but the calm, even tenor carried a heavy weight that instantly silenced the table. 5 heads snapped in my direction. Valerie looked up, the warm, maternal smile freezing on her face. For a fraction of a second, raw panic flashed in her eyes before she scrambled to reassemble her mask. "Riley, darling," she stammered, her voice pitching slightly higher than normal. "What a wonderful surprise! I did not realize you were a guest here today. We were just talking about your little merger." She reached out, attempting to pat my hand, trying to draw me into the collaborative lie. She expected me to play along. She assumed the social pressure of the country club environment would force me into polite submission, just as it always had at family dinners. I did not take her hand. I remained standing, looking down at her with a detached, clinical gaze. "Actually, Mom," I said, allowing my voice to project just enough to ensure the surrounding tables could hear the clarity of my words. "You did not contribute a dime to my education or my career." The air around the table instantly evaporated. Patricia lowered her glass, her eyes darting nervously between my face and my mother's rigid posture. "I self-funded every single bit of my tuition, and my early portfolios I continued, my tone remaining strictly conversational, devoid of any anger or hysteria. You and Dad never provided any seed capital for me. You funneled your entire life savings into Audrey's failing business ventures. I built my career entirely on my own, despite your constant reminders that I was a disappointment. Please stop taking credit for a life you actively tried to diminish." The dining room seemed to lose its underlying hum. The silence that fell over Valerie's table was profound and absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a curated narrative being severed in public. Valerie flushed a deep, humiliating crimson, the color creeping up her neck and staining her cheeks. Her mouth opened, searching for a witty deflection, a scolding reprimand, any tool she usually wielded to restore her dominance. But she found nothing. The truth was too sharp, delivered too calmly, leaving no room for interpretation or debate. I did not wait for a response. I did not stand there gloating or demanding an apology. I simply offered the stunned women a polite nod, turned on my heel, and walked back to my client. That public correction was a monumental shift in our dynamic. The plot twist for Valerie was not merely the revelation of my hidden wealth. She could have managed that reality, twisting it into another bragging point for her social circle. The true shock, the devastating blow that shattered her confidence, was my sudden, unshakable refusal to let her claim it. I had drawn a boundary in the middle of her most sacred arena. Sitting back down with my client, I signed the logistics contract, my hand perfectly steady. I knew Valerie was watching me from across the room, her social standing bleeding out onto the white linen tablecloth. Her friends would smile and offer polite excuses, but the gossip would spread like wildfire before the brunch service ended. They now knew Valerie was a liar, a woman who neglected her successful child to fund a fraud. This public humiliation would push my mother into a corner. She was losing her grip on the narrative, and her desperate need to regain control would only blind her further to the legal snare closing tightly around her ankles. She believed the loss of her country club reputation was the worst thing that could happen to her. She had no idea that a far more devastating storm was gathering, triggered by a phone call we were about to receive regarding Grandma Edith's rapidly failing heart. November arrived in the Pacific Northwest, carrying a bitter, biting chill that stripped the last remaining leaves from the maple trees and turned the city skies a permanent shade of bruised purple. The telephone call from the assisted care facility came shortly before dawn on a Thursday morning. A soft-spoken nurse informed me that my grandmother had passed away peacefully in her sleep during the night. I sat on the edge of my bed watching the early morning fog roll across the Seattle skyline, feeling a profound, heavy sorrow settle into my chest. I mourned the loss of the only relative who possessed the vision to see my true worth. Edith was a woman of quiet endurance, a pillar of resilience in a family governed by shallow vanity. I spent that evening sitting by my floor-to-ceiling windows, holding the cold brass key she had given me, grateful she was finally free from the indignities of a failing body. While I processed the genuine grief of losing my grandmother, a very different kind of ending was unfolding in the suburbs. The timeline of events was rapidly snapping into place, closing the loop between the fraudulent actions of the summer and the inevitable reckoning of the winter. By the first week of November, Audrey's highly publicized eco-lifestyle brand had entirely imploded. The lavish rooftop launch party had successfully drained the stolen capital, producing beautiful curated photographs, but zero actual revenue. The cheap drop-shipped inventory languished in a rented warehouse gathering dust as her digital engagement plummeted. Vendors and independent suppliers, tired of empty promises and bounced checks, formally demanded upfront wire transfers before shipping any additional merchandise. The manufactured illusion of her success fractured, exposing the hollow reality underneath. More critically, the predatory online lender officially registered a missed payment. The short grace period evaporated. The $150,000 credit line was now actively entering default. Automated collection emails triggered daily warnings, escalating in severity. The shadow bank began mailing formal notices of delinquency addressed directly to me as the primary guarantor. Valerie intercepted the physical mail at her suburban address, tearing up the final demand letters and burying them at the bottom of her recycling bin. She operated under the delusional premise that ignoring a federal financial institution would magically stall the collection process. They were drowning in a self-inflicted financial crisis, teetering on the edge of a devastating collapse. Yet when our family gathered for the memorial service at the suburban chapel a few days later, my mother and sister did not look like two women facing federal wire fraud charges. They did not exhibit the stressed, frantic energy of debtors dodging collection agencies. Instead, they looked quietly elated. They masked their joy behind tailored dark clothing and practiced solemn expressions, but the greedy anticipation radiated from their pores like heat off a sun-baked highway. As I sat in the back pew of the chapel listening to the pastor deliver a sanitized eulogy for a woman he barely knew, I watched Valerie and Audrey exchange subtle, knowing glances. They were practically vibrating with a shared secret thrill. The reason for their inappropriate giddiness was simple. They believed Edith's death was a miraculous, perfectly timed rescue. Valerie assumed the sprawling agricultural estate in eastern Washington would be liquidated and divided evenly among the surviving heirs. In her mind, the inheritance would generate a massive windfall of liquid cash, arriving just in time to quietly wipe out the forged commercial loan before the bank could launch a formal fraud investigation. They thought the universe was rewarding their cleverness. They believed they had successfully outsmarted the system, utilizing my pristine credit to bridge the gap until the estate paid out. They stood in the hallowed sanctuary of the church, surrounded by floral wreaths and grieving acquaintances brazenly plotting the sale of dirt they did not own. They were completely unaware that Edith's lucrative land had been legally transferred into my private trust 6 months prior. They had no idea that the safety net they were relying on had been severed long before they even decided to jump. As the funeral service concluded and the congregation began the slow, shuffling exodus toward the vestibule, The scene I described earlier played out with sharp, agonizing clarity. The rain battered the stained glass windows. Valerie adjusted her dramatic black fascinator, leaned into my father, and delivered her eager whisper about contacting the real estate agents. She was banking her entire financial survival on a mirage. I followed them out into the damp chill of the chapel foyer. The air smelled of wet wool coats, wilting lilies, and dusty hymnals. Derek separated from Valerie for a brief moment, weaving through the lingering mourners to intercept me near the heavy wooden exit doors. His posture was rigid, his eyes darting nervously toward my mother to ensure he was following her unwritten script perfectly. "Riley," he said, keeping his voice low and devoid of any paternal warmth. "The estate attorney called this morning. The formal reading of the will is scheduled for this coming Tuesday at his downtown office. We expect you to be there promptly at 10 o'clock. I met his gaze, refusing to offer the submissive nod he was accustomed to receiving. "I will be there," I replied evenly. Valerie materialized at his side, slipping her arm through his with a possessive grip. She looked me up and down, her eyes dragging over my simple charcoal coat with unmistakable disdain. The prospect of imminent wealth had inflated her arrogance to dangerous new proportions. She felt untouchable, emboldened by the belief that her financial crimes were about to be erased by a dead woman's generosity. "Dress nicely for the appointment, Riley," Valerie sneered, her voice carrying a sharp, condescending edge that cut through the polite murmurs of the departing crowd. "The lawyer's office is in a very respectable building. Try not to embarrass us." She offered a tight, patronizing smile, turned on her heel, and marched out into the Seattle storm. Audrey trailed closely behind her, tapping rapidly on her smartphone screen, likely browsing luxury real estate listings or designer handbags she planned to purchase with her imaginary inheritance. I stood in the doorway of the chapel, watching their vehicle pull away from the curb. The sheer audacity of her parting insult did not sting. It merely cemented my resolve. Valerie was marching confidently toward a legal landmine, actively taunting the only person who held the map to the explosive. The loop was finally closing. The stage was perfectly set for Tuesday morning. They were walking into that mahogany-paneled law office, expecting to receive the keys to a kingdom. They expected a grand, triumphant payout that would validate their cruelty and fund their delusions for another decade. They had absolutely no idea that I was bringing the heavy brass key resting in my pocket, nor did they realize my corporate attorney was preparing to deliver a sealed prosecution packet that would lock the doors behind them. Tuesday morning arrived with a biting frost that coated the Seattle streets in a thin layer of ice. The downtown law office of Mr. Mitchell occupied the 42nd floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavy and archaic. The conference room was lined with dark mahogany panels and smelled faintly of lemon polish and aged paper. I sat at the far end of a long, polished table. My posture remained relaxed, but my mind operated with calculated precision. Valerie sat directly across from me. She practically vibrated with a potent mixture of greed and impatience. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that screamed of quiet luxury, a carefully chosen ensemble designed to project the image of a wealthy, grieving matriarch. Her manicured fingers drummed a frantic rhythm against the leather strap of her designer handbag. Beside her, Audrey slouched in her high-backed chair, looking profoundly bored. Audrey wore oversized dark sunglasses indoors, shielding her eyes from the bright fluorescent lights, occasionally tapping her phone screen with sharp acrylic nails. Her eco-lifestyle brand was currently drowning in debt. Suppliers were demanding payment, and the online shadow bank was sending collection notices. Yet she sat there, acting as though this legal proceeding was merely a minor inconvenience delaying her inevitable payout. Derek occupied the seat next to my mother. He stared blankly at a yellow legal pad resting on the table, attempting to shrink into the expensive upholstery. He wanted the money just as much as Valerie did, but he preferred to let her do the dirty work of demanding it. Mr. Mitchell, the estate attorney, entered the room carrying a thick leather folder. He was a meticulous man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, possessing a demeanor that suggested he had witnessed decades of family greed playing out exactly like this. He took his seat at the head of the table, adjusted his spectacles, and opened the folder with agonizing slowness. Valerie leaned forward, her eyes locked onto the documents like a starving predator. "We are here to formally execute the final wishes and distribute the remaining assets of the late Edith Long." Mr. Mitchell began, his voice dry and devoid of emotion. He cleared his throat and started reading the standard legal boilerplate detailing the payment of final medical expenses and the settlement of minor outstanding debts. Valerie sighed loudly, shifting her weight in the chair. "Just get to the assets," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for the entire room to hear. Mr. Mitchell offered her a brief, unimpressed glance before returning to the pages. He listed the distribution of minor heirlooms. A vintage gold pocket watch was bequeathed to Derek. A collection of antique pearl jewelry was designated for Audrey. A small savings account containing a few $1,000s was allocated to cover the immediate costs of the memorial service. Audrey scoffed, pushing her sunglasses up into her blonde hair. "Pearl jewelry," she whispered to Valerie. "I cannot pay my vendors with dusty old pearls. Where is the actual money?" Valerie reached over and squeezed Audrey's arm, her smile tight and terrifying. "Patience, darling," my mother murmured. Mr. Mitchell turned a page. Valerie could no longer contain the swelling anticipation. She slapped her hand flat against the mahogany table, the sharp smack echoing in the quiet room. "Excuse me, Mr. Mitchell," Valerie interrupted, dropping the grieving daughter facade entirely. "We appreciate the sentimental items, we truly do, but we are busy people, and we need to discuss the primary assets. Let us get to the Eastern Washington real estate. My mother owned a very large commercial tract out there. We need to know the exact appraisal value and the timeline for liquidation. I have already spoken to a broker, and we are ready to list the property by Friday." The silence that followed her demand felt incredibly dense. Mr. Mitchell did not flinch. He slowly removed his wire-rimmed glasses, placing them meticulously beside the open folder. He looked directly at Valerie, his expression completely blank. "I am afraid there is a misunderstanding regarding the Eastern Washington property, Mr. Mitchell," stated, his tone remaining perfectly level. "Those specific assets are not included in this estate." Valerie froze. Her hand remained flat on the table, her knuckles turning white. The color drained from her face, replaced by a pale, sickly hue. Beside her, Audrey stopped tapping her phone. Derek finally looked up from his blank notepad, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "What do you mean they are not in the estate?" Valerie asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. "My mother owned that land for 40 years. It is the only thing of actual value she possessed. Did she sell it to cover her medical bills? Where did the funds go?" "The property was not sold," Mr. Mitchell clarified. "The land and all associated corporate leases were legally transferred via an irrevocable deed prior to her death. She gifted the entire portfolio to a singular beneficiary while she was still living. Therefore, it bypasses the probate process entirely." The reality of his words struck Valerie with the force of a physical blow. The massive windfall she had banked her entire future upon, the imaginary fortune she planned to use to erase her federal crimes and fund Audrey's failing business, evaporated into thin air. Her breathing grew shallow and erratic. Transferred Valerie choked out the words scraping against her throat. "To whom? Who manipulated my mother into signing away our inheritance?" Mr. Mitchell shifted his gaze down the length of the table, his eyes settling on me. "The property was transferred to Miss Riley Long," he answered. She is the sole legal owner of the land and the sole beneficiary of the Associated Trust. The room erupted. Valerie shot up from her leather chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed onto the carpet. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The polished, wealthy matriarch vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. "That is a lie," Valerie shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my face. "She is a disappointment. Edith would never give her anything of value. Riley manipulated a dying woman. This is elder abuse. She forged the paperwork. I will have you disbarred for allowing this, Mr. Mitchell. We will contest this will. We will drag this through the courts until she is bankrupt. She has no proof. I want to see the original documents right now." Audrey began to hyperventilate, clutching her designer bag to her chest. "Mom, what are we going to do?" she panicked, her voice shrill and frantic. "The bank is going to call the loan. We need that money." Derek stood up, his hands raised in a futile attempt to pacify the chaos. "Valerie, calm down," he pleaded. But she shoved him aside, her eyes locked on me with lethal intent. "Show me the proof," Valerie demanded, slamming her fists onto the table. "Show me the deed you stole from us." I remained seated. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch from her venom. I slowly reached into the deep pocket of my wool coat. My fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy metal I had carried for 6 months. I pulled my hand out and placed Grandma Edith's brass key onto the polished mahogany table. The visceral clink of metal against wood echoed sharply, instantly silencing Valerie's tirade. Mr. Mitchell nodded. He reached across the desk, picked up the brass key, and turned toward a heavy steel lockbox sitting on the credenza behind his chair. He inserted the key into the mechanism. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. He opened the lid and retrieved a thick stack of pristine documents, placing them directly in the center of the table for everyone to see. On top was the original warranty deed, bearing the raised notary seal and Edith's unmistakable signature. It was flawless, undeniable, and legally bulletproof. Valerie stared at the paper, her chest heaving. The realization that she possessed zero legal standing crushed the last remaining breath from her lungs. She collapsed back into a spare chair, her hands covering her face. But the trap was not finished springing. The deed was merely the bait. The true devastation lay on the second page. Mr. Mitchell peeled the deed back to reveal another document underneath. This one was older, the edges slightly yellowed, but the signatures were crisp and clear. Furthermore, Mr. Mitchell announced, his voice carrying the weight of a final verdict. Ms. Long provided me with this document for safekeeping alongside the deed. It is a legally binding revocation of power of attorney, signed, dated, and notarized 6 years ago. I watched Valerie's hand slowly drop from her face. Her eyes widened, pupils dilating in sheer terror as she stared at the yellowed paper. When I graduated from university, I decided to sever all financial ties to my parents, I said, speaking for the first time since entering the room. My voice was calm, steady, and utterly relentless. I formally revoked the college-era power of attorney you kept in your desk drawer. The state recorded the revocation. I just never told you because I knew you would take it as a personal insult. The color drained from Audrey's face as the implications washed over her. Derek looked back and forth between us, the true horror of the situation finally piercing his deliberate ignorance. Valerie tried to speak, but her jaw simply trembled. No words came out. Chekhov's gun had just fired point blank. The outdated document Valerie had brazenly uploaded to the Shadowbank portal, the exact mechanism she used to forge the $150,000 commercial loan, had been legally dead for years. By utilizing a revoked instrument to secure a credit line across state borders, she had stripped away any possible defense of a misunderstanding. She could not claim it was a clerical error. She could not claim she thought she still had permission. The forensic evidence was now paired with an undeniable legal timeline. It was premeditated, documented, undeniable wire fraud. The air in the mahogany room grew thin and cold. Valerie realized the inheritance was gone. Audrey realized the business was dead. And together, staring at the revoked power of attorney resting on the polished table, they finally understood that the daughter they had treated as a useless utility now held the absolute power to send them both to federal prison. The silence that filled the space was no longer just the quiet of a law office. It was the terrifying silence of a checkmate. The suffocating quiet inside the mahogany-paneled conference room held for perhaps 5 seconds before it fractured like brittle ice under a heavy boot. The reality of the revoked legal document resting on the polished table finally pierced the thick armor of my mother's delusion. Valerie shot up from her chair, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. The elegant, grieving matriarch persona she had so carefully curated for the country club audience dissolved instantly, replaced by a raw, unfiltered panic. "We will sue you!" Valerie screamed. Her voice was shrill, bouncing harshly off the wood-paneled walls, stripped of all its usual refined cadence. She slammed both hands onto the table, leaning forward until her face was inches from the legal paperwork. "We will drag you through civil litigation until you have nothing left. We will tie this up in court for decades, Riley. You are not going to steal our future." She hurled the threats with a desperate, breathless intensity. She operated under the false assumption that volume and intimidation could somehow alter the legal truth. She believed that if she made the situation painful enough, I would simply surrender the Eastern Washington property to make the screaming stop. Her eyes were wide and feral, searching my face for any sign of the usual submission she had commanded for 28 years. Beside her, Audrey abandoned her bored, detached posture. The oversized designer sunglasses slipped down her nose as her face crumpled into genuine terror. The realization that the imaginary inheritance was gone, coupled with the crushing weight of her failing eco-lifestyle brand, triggered a profound panic attack. She burst into loud, jagged sobs, her acrylic nails digging fiercely into the fabric of my father's suit jacket. "Dad, do something!" Audrey wailed, her voice cracking under the strain. "The bank is calling my cell phone every single day. They're threatening to seize my business accounts and my personal assets. We need that money right now. Fix this!" Derek stared down at his oldest daughter, his jaw hanging slightly open. For 30 years, my father had navigated domestic crises by choosing the path of least resistance. He functioned as a passive enabler, writing small checks and demanding my silent obedience to ensure his evenings remained peaceful. But as he looked at the undeniable proof of federal wire fraud resting in front of him, the color drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen gray. There was no check large enough to cover a felony. He could not pacify a federal financial institution with a disappointed sigh. He looked utterly powerless. A man realizing his lifelong strategy of avoidance had finally led him over a steep cliff. A few feet away, standing near the leather seating area, Audrey's husband began to move. Spencer was a mid-level marketing executive who had married into our family specifically for the projected wealth and social climbing potential. He had always happily encouraged Audrey's extravagant spending, operating under the assumption that Valerie would always bail them out of any financial hardship. But Spencer was not a fool when it came to self-preservation. Listening to Mr. Mitchell explain the revoked authorization, the gears turned rapidly in his head. He recognized the exact legal definition of forging a signature to secure a commercial credit line. Spencer took a slow, deliberate step backward. His expensive dress shoes scuffed against the thick carpet as he retreated toward the heavy oak door. He was physically distancing himself from his wife, putting as much space as possible between his own pristine corporate record and her impending criminal charges. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He just kept backing away, his eyes darting toward the exit. Valerie realized Derek was paralyzed and Spencer was retreating. She had lost her audience and her enforcers. She pivoted her focus back to me, her eyes wild and feverish. She abandoned the hollow legal threats and resorted to the oldest tools in her arsenal. She attempted to corner me, using a lifetime of weaponized guilt and psychological intimidation. She marched around the edge of the conference table, closing the physical distance between us. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. "You owe this family, Riley," Valerie demanded, her chest heaving with exertion. "We raised you. We fed you. We gave you everything you needed to succeed. You are acting like a selfish, ungrateful child. You will sign that land over to us right now, or you are dead to me. Do you hear me? You will be entirely cut off." She delivered the ultimatum with a terrifying, righteous conviction. She genuinely thought the threat of being disowned would send me into a spiral of anxiety. In the past, the mere thought of losing my mother's conditional affection would have caused my hands to shake. I would have scrambled to apologize, desperate to mend the fracture, willing to sacrifice my own stability just to be allowed back into the fold. They thought if they screamed loud enough, the old Riley would emerge from the shadows and clean up their mess. But the old Riley was gone, buried somewhere in the dusty, arid plains of eastern Washington. I looked at my mother's flushed, angry face. I heard the venom in her voice and the frantic sobbing of my sister echoing in the background. I felt the ambient tension radiating from my father, and in the center of that emotional hurricane, I felt an immense, unbreakable calm. The threat of being dead to her did not feel like a punishment. It felt like a pardon. It felt like the heavy iron gates of a prison finally swinging open, granting me a clean exit. I did not shrink back from her pointing finger. I stood up from my leather chair, rising slowly to my full height. I reached down and fastened the center button of my charcoal wool blazer. The simple, deliberate motion carried a profound weight, signaling the definitive end of the negotiation. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I did not offer a single word of defense or explanation. I simply looked at her, my expression devoid of any fear, anger, or sorrow. Valerie's rant faltered. The screaming died in her throat as she registered the cold, clinical detachment in my eyes. The sudden absence of my usual submission unnerved her more than any shout could have. She took a half step back, her confidence finally cracking under the weight of my silence. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I did not break eye contact with my mother as I tapped a single pre-programmed icon on the screen. The silent signal beamed out of the room, traveling to the waiting area just down the hall. 10 seconds later, the brass handle of the conference room door turned with a sharp click. The heavy oak swung open, interrupting Audrey's crying and Derek's stunned paralysis. Harrison stepped into the room. My corporate attorney wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, his demeanor radiating a ruthless professional efficiency that instantly altered the atmospheric pressure of the space. He did not introduce himself or offer any polite condolences for our recent family loss. He walked directly toward the polished mahogany table, his gaze sweeping over Valerie and Audrey with the cold assessment of a predator calculating the weakness of its prey. Tucked securely under his right arm was a thick black binder. It contained the meticulously assembled prosecution packet. Inside those rigid covers lay the digital Internet Protocol logs, the wire transfer receipts, the bank communications, and the irrefutable forensic evidence of their financial crimes. Harrison stopped beside my chair. He placed the heavy binder onto the table with a dull thud that sounded exactly like a gavel striking a judge's bench. The chaotic, desperate denial of my family hit a solid brick wall. The screaming was officially over, and the era of consequences had arrived. Harrison stood tall beside my chair, a silent sentinel in a tailored suit. The heavy black binder he had just placed onto the polished mahogany surface seemed to absorb all the remaining oxygen in the room. Valerie had spent the last 2 minutes screaming about civil litigation and dragging my name through the courts. Her chest was still heaving from the exertion of her hollow threats. I looked at the rigid plastic spine of the binder, then lifted my gaze to meet my mother's wild, frantic eyes. "Since we are discussing legal action," I said, my voice dropping the ambient temperature of the room by several degrees, "let us talk about the $150,000 commercial loan." The effect of those words was instantaneous and profound. Valerie stopped breathing. The angry flush that had stained her cheeks a deep crimson vanished, draining away in a fraction of a second, leaving her skin an ashen, chalky white. Her jaw slackened. The fierce, combative matriarch disappeared, replaced by a woman who had just stepped onto a trap door while holding the lever. Beside her, Audrey let out a short, strangled gasp. She stopped clutching our father's jacket and shrank back into her leather chair, pulling her knees together as if trying to make herself as small as possible. Harrison did not wait for them to recover. He reached out and flipped the heavy cover of the binder open. The crisp, white pages inside were organized with clinical precision, separated by sharp plastic tabs. "My name is Harrison Vance," he stated. His voice was a rich, authoritative baritone that commanded the space, leaving no room for interruption. "I represent Ms. Long in all corporate and personal legal matters. We have spent the last several weeks conducting a thorough forensic audit of a credit line originated through an online financial institution." He turned to the first tab, sliding a printed spreadsheet across the smooth wood so it rested directly in front of my mother. "We acquired the digital access logs from the lender." Harrison continued tapping a silver pen against the top row of data. "This document displays the Internet Protocol address used to submit the initial application. The address traces directly to the wireless router located inside your suburban residence, Valerie. The timestamp correlates exactly with the moment the digital signature was affixed." Valerie stared at the spreadsheet. Her hands began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that rattled the gold bracelets on her wrists. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to formulate another lie, or offer a desperate excuse, but her throat yielded no sound. Harrison turned to the next section of the binder. He produced a stack of banking records, fanning them out like a deck of lethal cards. "These are the wire transfer receipts," he explained, shifting his focus to my sister. "The principal sum of $150,000 was deposited into a limited liability company registered under your name, Audrey. Over the subsequent 48 hours, those funds were methodically drained to secure event venues, luxury catering, and personal retail purchases. This establishes a clear, undeniable chain of embezzlement and misappropriation of stolen capital." Audrey squeezed her eyes shut, tears spilling over her lashes and ruining her carefully applied makeup. She clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle her rising sobs. Spencer, her husband, had seen enough. He did not say a single word to his weeping wife. He simply turned the brass handle of the conference room door and slipped out into the hallway, abandoning her to face the incoming storm alone. Finally, Harrison extracted the most devastating piece of evidence. He placed a high-resolution color copy of the uploaded power of attorney document next to the banking records. This is the instrument utilized to bypass the lender's identity verification protocols, Harrison said. You presented this to a federal financial institution as a valid, binding contract. However, as Mr. Mitchell just confirmed, this specific authorization was formally revoked years ago. Harrison paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in the suffocating reality of their actions. By utilizing a revoked legal instrument to forge a signature and secure a commercial credit line across state borders, Harrison concluded, his tone devoid of any sympathy, you have committed identity theft and wire fraud. These are Class B felonies. The federal sentencing guidelines for these specific infractions involve mandatory incarceration. Derek groaned, a wretched, hollow sound that seemed to originate from deep within his chest. He slumped forward, burying his face in both of his hands, his shoulders shaking. The comfortable, quiet life he had sacrificed my childhood to maintain was gone, burned to ash by the very people he had enabled. The fight had entirely drained out of Valerie. She sat, slumped in her chair, her posture broken, staring blankly at the forensic proof of her impending ruin. The shadow bank is currently pursuing the guarantor, I explained, taking control of the conversation. My voice remained strictly business, crisp and unsentimental. The credit line is in default. The collection agencies are preparing to seize assets to recover the stolen funds. I will not allow my corporate equity or my Eastern Washington Real Estate Trust to be compromised by your sheer incompetence. I refuse to act as your human shield. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany table, forcing Valerie to look me in the eye. Here are your options, I told them. Option 1. Harrison takes this binder, walks out of this building, and hands the entire prosecution packet directly to the district attorney before noon today. The authorities will issue warrants. You and Audrey will both face federal prosecution, public trials, and prison time. I let the word prison hang in the air. Audrey whimpered, curling further into herself. Option 2. I continued, my tone unyielding. You sign the liquidation agreements Harrison has prepared. Audrey, you will dissolve your limited liability company today. You will surrender any remaining inventory to liquidators. Valerie and Derek, you will immediately list your suburban house for sale. You will downsize your entire life, and you will use the equity from your home to repay the shadow bank in full by this Friday. Valerie gasped, her breath catching on a jagged sob. She looked at me through watery, red-rimmed eyes, her expression a mix of profound shock and lingering entitlement. You are making us sell our home, she whispered, her voice fragile and trembling. You are making us homeless. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not soften the blow. No, I corrected her, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. You made yourselves debtors the moment you forged my name. I am offering you a way to stay out of a prison cell. I suggest you take it. Harrison pulled a set of crisp legal contracts from the back of the binder. These documents were irrevocable liquidation and repayment agreements granting my legal team the authority to oversee the sale of their assets and ensure the stolen funds were routed directly to the lender. He placed a contract in front of Audrey and another in front of my parents. He set a heavy silver pen beside each stack of paper. Sign the agreements, Harrison instructed, or we conclude this meeting and I make the phone call to the prosecutor's office. The room fell agonizingly quiet, save for the sound of Audrey crying and the distant hum of the city traffic far below. They had no moves left. There were no hidden inheritance funds to bail them out. There were no wealthy relatives left to manipulate. They were trapped in a corner they had built with their own hands. Derek was the first to move. He lowered his hands from his face, his skin pale and lined with sudden, deep exhaustion. He did not look at Valerie. He reached out, picked up the silver pen, and signed his name on the dotted line. He slid the document toward my mother. Valerie stared at the pen as if it were a venomous snake. Signing that paper meant sacrificing her country club status, her beautiful, curated suburban house, and her entire false identity. It meant accepting total public defeat. But the alternative was a federal indictment. Her hand shook with a fine, rapid tremor as she picked up the pen. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a dark line of mascara down her cheek, landing on the crisp white page. It was the only genuine tear I had ever seen her shed, born not from remorse, but from the agonizing pain of losing her precious optics. Trembling, she pressed the ink to the paper and signed away her empire. Audrey followed suit, weeping openly as she dismantled her eco-lifestyle brand with a few shaky strokes of the pen. Harrison retrieved the signed contracts, inspecting them carefully before sliding them back into his secure briefcase. The checkmate was officially recorded. The trap had sprung closed and locked. I sat back in my chair, looking at the broken, silent figures across the table, feeling a strange, profound emptiness that slowly began to fill with the bright, clear light of freedom. I did not linger in the mahogany-paneled conference room to watch them weep over the ruins of their own choices. Harrison gathered the signed liquidation agreements, his swift professional motions signaling the definitive end of our meeting. I stood up, fastened the center button of my charcoal coat, and offered my parents and my sister a final brief glance. They did not look back at me. They remained frozen in their expensive leather chairs, staring blankly at the polished wood table, trapped in the crushing gravity of their new reality. I turned and walked out the heavy oak door. The elevator descent from the 42nd floor felt remarkably different this time. The subtle drop in air pressure did not tighten my chest. It lifted a suffocating weight I had carried since childhood. When the glass doors parted at the lobby level, I stepped out onto the busy downtown Seattle pavement. The freezing November wind hit my face, crisp and stinging, carrying the scent of roasted coffee and wet asphalt. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the sharp chill. There was no triumphant gloating bubbling up inside me. I did not feel the urge to cheer in victory or celebrate their downfall. What washed over me was a profound, permanent relief. The toxic tether to my mother's vanity and my sister's delusion had finally snapped. Over the next several weeks, the consequences orchestrated in that law office played out with mathematical certainty. Valerie and Derek listed their sprawling suburban home on the market the very next morning. They priced the real estate ruthlessly low, desperate to secure a rapid cash offer before the shadow bank could initiate formal asset seizure. I watched the listing populate online, scrolling through the sterile photographs of the staged living room where I had endured so many cruel birthday dinners. The property sold in less than 10 days to a young software executive. My parents were forced to downsize into a modest, cramped apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, stripping away the grand architectural facade my mother had used to shield her deep insecurities. The loss of the real estate was merely the first falling domino. Without their primary asset, and crippled by the immense repayment schedule, Valerie could no longer sustain the exorbitant monthly dues required by the Oak Ridge Country Club. The board of directors, already buzzing with the scandalous rumors Patricia had eagerly circulated following our Sunday brunch encounter, acted swiftly. They issued a polite but firm letter revoking her membership due to insufficient financial standing. In Valerie's world, losing that membership was worse than facing a judge. It was a total social erasure. The wealthy peers she had worshipped stopped returning her calls. Her name was quietly struck from the charity gala guest lists. She retreated into the shadows of her new small apartment, her carefully curated identity reduced to dust. She had spent her entire adult life judging others based on their net worth, and now she was forced to live under the exact same unforgiving metric. Audrey faced an equally devastating descent. The swift liquidation of her eco-lifestyle brand satisfied the federal requirements of our contract, keeping her out of a prison cell, but it left her drowning in the wake of her remaining personal credit card debt. Spencer followed through on his silent retreat from the conference room, filing for divorce shortly after the Thanksgiving holiday, legally insulating his corporate career from her radioactive reputation. Stripped of her fake investors, her stolen capital, and her husband, Audrey needed a steady paycheck to survive. The poetic justice of her new situation was exquisite. The aspiring lifestyle influencer who once hosted lavish rooftop parties funded by wire fraud was forced to accept a minimum wage position at a fast fashion retail outlet inside a declining suburban shopping mall. It was the exact same store she had mocked mercilessly in a viral video 2 years prior. A clip where she sneered at the cheap synthetic fabrics and the unflattering fluorescent lighting. Now she spent 8 hours a day standing under those same harsh bulbs. She wore a standard polyester uniform, folding discounted sweaters, scanning barcodes, and ringing up customers who did not care about her digital aesthetic. The glamorous online facade was permanently dismantled, replaced by the grueling reality of the manual labor she had always considered beneath her. Following the signing of the liquidation agreements, they never spoke to me again. My phone stopped ringing with late-night demands. My email inbox remained free of passive-aggressive guilt trips. The suffocating expectation that I existed solely to serve their needs evaporated into thin air. Some people might find the permanent silence of their own bloodline painful, an aching void where family should reside. I did not feel an ache. I felt freedom. The silence was not a punishment. It was a sanctuary. I had successfully insulated my life from their chaos, establishing an ironclad perimeter they could never breach again. The following weekend, the skies over Seattle cleared, offering a rare, bright window in the middle of the Pacific Northwest winter. I packed a small travel bag, climbed into my car, and drove east. The journey across the Cascade Mountains felt like a physical transition from the past into the future. I watched the dense, weeping evergreens fade in the rearview mirror, yielding to the vast, open expanse of the Columbia River Basin. The environment shifted from damp and claustrophobic to dry, sunlit, and expansive. I arrived at the high-security gates of my commercial property just as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. The uniformed guard recognized me instantly, offering a respectful nod as the heavy steel barriers glided open. I drove past the administrative hub and parked near the edge of the sprawling compound, stepping out onto the arid earth. The temperature was cold, but the golden sunlight warming my face felt incredibly grounding. I walked toward the perimeter fence, standing alone in the shadow of the colossal white structures. The low, steady hum of the industrial cooling fans filled the quiet desert air. It was the sound of endurance, the sound of a foundation built on solid rock rather than rotting wood. I reached into the pocket of my wool coat and closed my fingers around the heavy brass key Grandma Edith had pressed into my palm on my 28th birthday. She had recognized my strength long before I possessed the courage to wield it. She knew I was not the disappointment my mother claimed I was. I was the architect. I looked out over the golden plains, watching the sunlight catch the edges of the distant rolling hills. I had built a highly successful career, protected my wealth, and established unyielding boundaries without ever needing to shout or beg for their permission. I let the truth do the heavy lifting, allowing reality to dismantle their delusions. The fortress Edith told me to build was standing, strong, impenetrable, and secure. In the quiet of the eastern Washington plains, far away from the manufactured drama and the toxic expectations of my past, I took a deep, steady breath. I had finally chosen my own peace. We are raised on a very specific, glittering version of the American dream. It is a dream painted in the broad, comforting strokes of manicured suburban lawns, elaborate holiday dinners, and the unwavering, almost sacred belief that family is the ultimate sanctuary. We are taught from a very young age that a traditional family structure is a fortress meant to protect us from the cold realities of the outside world. But what happens when the architects of that dream, the very parents tasked with our emotional and physical safety, build a house on a foundation of favoritism, manipulation, and deceit? In the story of Riley Long, we witness the catastrophic, slow-motion collapse of a family that traded authentic love for superficial optics. It is a narrative that forces us to look closely at the mahogany dining tables of our own childhoods and ask a terrifying, deeply uncomfortable question. Were we raised to be whole, independent human beings? Or were we merely raised to be useful? At the heart of Riley's journey is a profound exploration of parenting values and the destructive nature of conditional love. In many modern American homes, the pressure to project an image of absolute perfection can warp a parent's compass. This creates a toxic dichotomy within the household: the golden child and the disappointment. Valerie, the matriarch, invested all her emotional and financial capital into Audrey, a daughter who mirrored her own shallow vanities. Audrey was taught that her worth was intrinsically tied to her aesthetic, her status, and her ability to perform for an audience. On the surface, it looked like extreme favoritism, but in reality, it was a profound failure of long-term guidance. By shielding Audrey from consequence and funding her delusions, Valerie did not prepare her daughter for the real world. She crippled her. She taught her that entitlement is a viable substitute for effort, a lesson that ultimately left Audrey bankrupt and broken the moment reality demanded payment. Conversely, Riley was cast as the family's utility, the sensible and visible load-bearing pillar whose only purpose was to silently absorb the family's stress and subsidize their failures. Valerie's parenting lacked the most crucial elements of emotional awareness and fundamental fairness. Honesty was sacrificed at the altar of public perception. When parents prioritize how their family is perceived by the country club, the neighbors, or the digital ether over the actual emotional well-being of their children, they commit a quiet, insidious violence. They teach their children that their authentic selves are unacceptable. Riley was forced to hide her staggering corporate success simply because it did not fit the narrative her mother had meticulously scripted. This is the danger of raising children without emotional integrity. You do not build a family, you cast a play. And when the actors eventually decide to walk off the stage, the entire production shatters. Yet the tragedy of this family is not solely the fault of the aggressive narcissist. It is equally the fault of the passive enabler. Derek, the father, represents a tragic, all-too-common archetype in traditional family structures. He is the parent who trades fairness for quiet, the man who demands his children keep the peace at the expense of their own boundaries. Family responsibility is not merely about providing a roof or a steady paycheck. It requires the courage to stand up to injustice, even when that injustice is being perpetrated by your own spouse. By looking down at his steak while his daughter was emotionally eviscerated at her own birthday dinner, Derek taught Riley that her pain was less important than his comfort. He demonstrated that peace, built on the subjugation of a child, is not peace at all. It is cowardice. True parental guidance requires the emotional fortitude to protect your children from the storms, not throw them into the rain so you can stay dry. True parenting, true generational guidance, was ultimately demonstrated not by Riley's mother or father, but by Grandma Edith. Edith embodied the rugged, resilient spirit that often defines the best parts of American culture. She understood that you cannot evaluate the strength of a fence by the brightness of its paint. She looked past the shiny exterior of her family and saw the rotting wood beneath. And more importantly, She saw the quiet, enduring steel within Riley. Edith's gift of the Eastern Washington Data Center was not just a transfer of immense commercial wealth. It was a profound transfer of validation. It was an elder looking at the next generation and saying, "I see your endurance, and I honor it." Edith provided the long-term guidance that Valerie and Derek failed to give. She rewarded resilience, honesty, and hard work, ensuring that the child who actually possessed the strength to carry a legacy was given the fortress to protect it. The climax of Riley's story, the forged commercial loan, serves as a chilling metaphor for what happens when parental entitlement goes entirely unchecked. When parents view their children as extensions of themselves, they often fail to recognize their children's autonomy. Forging Riley's signature was a federal crime, yes, but on a deeper psychological level, it was the ultimate parental betrayal. It was the physical manifestation of a mother claiming ownership over her daughter's identity, her credit, and her future. The quiet checkmate that Riley orchestrates in the law office is not an act of vengeance. It is a necessary clinical amputation of a diseased limb. It is the enforcement of a boundary that should have been established in childhood. As we navigate the complexities of our own family dynamics, Riley's story holds a mirror up to our own lives. How many of us are carrying the heavy, rotting wood of our family's expectations? How many of us are shrinking our accomplishments to make room for someone else's fragile ego? If Riley's journey resonated with the quiet, unspoken battles you fight in your own life, you are not alone. There is a whole community of us learning to build our own fortresses. I encourage you to subscribe and follow Zara Told Stories for more narratives that explore the deep, often hidden truths of family resilience and reclaiming your power. Share this space with someone who needs to hear that it is okay to stop setting yourself on fire to keep your family warm. We are conditioned by culture, religion, and society to believe that forgiveness is the ultimate moral high ground. We are told that family is forever, that blood is thicker than water, and that true strength lies in our boundless capacity to forgive those who raised us, no matter the cost to our own souls. But perhaps this conventional wisdom is the very thing keeping us trapped. Perhaps the most profound, deeply ethical act of love you can offer a toxic family is not endless forgiveness, but absolute, unyielding consequence. By refusing to save her mother and sister from their own ruin, Riley did not destroy her family. She simply allowed gravity to do its job. Sometimes, walking away in total silence is not a failure of love. It is the ultimate triumph of self-respect. Because in the end, the peace we seek is rarely found in the homes we were born into. It is found in the fortresses we have the courage to build for ourselves. Are you still defending a house that is destined to collapse? Or are you ready to finally step out into the rain?